Welcome to Goodwin Law Unplugged, Florida real estate and more. This podcast features candid insight from real estate industry professionals from all sectors. Your host, attorney Matthew Goodwin, a native Floridian and experienced real estate attorney, will provide his personal insight on legal matters and feature other professionals offering their candid advice. Whether you're a first-time homebuyer, seasoned investor, or experienced real estate agent, there is something for everyone. Thanks for joining us on Goodwin Law Unplugged.
All right, thanks for tuning in for another episode of Goodwin Law Unplugged. This is going to be a good episode. We're going to talk about foreign buyers and sellers of real estate. Some of you listening may have heard the acronym FIRPTA before. Remember, this podcast is intended to educate real estate investors, real estate agents, and also buyers and sellers in general who are buying and selling real estate in Florida. And I'll just remind you again, listening in and of itself does not create an attorney-client privilege. We're not giving legal advice. This is more or less touching on topics that the public at large can benefit from. Today's episode particularly is dealing with issues that foreign sellers, and I'm really excited. The guest that I have on today, she works for a company called FIRPTA Solutions, and her name is Julie Lepore. She's been in the real estate industry for over 20 years and as the director of FIRPTA Solutions for the last 6 years. And I'm going to have her tell you about what FIRPTA Solutions does and about FIRPTA in general. And so, Julie, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you.
And why don't you start by telling us what FIRPTA stands for?
All right. Well, FIRPTA stands for, so the letters are FIRPTA, and it stands for the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act. And it was enacted back in the 80s because our government had the idea or saw the issue that foreigners were coming into the United States. They were purchasing all kinds of real estate investments and other types of things. And then they were selling it for profit, but they weren't paying any taxes. They weren't paying any capital gains tax. And so they realized that they didn't have any type of mechanism in place to, force these foreign sellers, these owners to file tax returns. And so if you think about withholding, I love to use the example of like a pay stub. Everyone knows what a pay stub is. Anyone who is an employee gets paid with a pay stub. And so, every Friday you're getting this paycheck and maybe you made $500, but really you only get to deposit $350. And that's because taxes were withheld by your employer. And so that's the concept of withholding. And so your employer has to withhold taxes. We have a pay-as-you-go tax system. And if you apply that concept to real estate, it's kind of the same thing, except for foreign sellers don't get paid every Friday, right? They get paid when they sell a property. And when they are at a closing table and they get, walking away with their big proceeds check, it's almost like a big giant paycheck. So if you think of it that way, and so as a foreign seller, I just sold this property. Maybe I made money, maybe I didn't, but the U.S. government doesn't know that. The IRS doesn't know if they're making money or not. And so they'll have a chance to settle up with that later. But right now, when they sell that property, all they know is that they want a withholding tax to be collected and sent to them in advance on behalf of the seller so that the seller can file a tax return. And if he doesn't owe that much money in taxes, he can get a refund, just like you and I do when we file our taxes.
Okay. That's a real easy way to understand, digest a otherwise complex subject. I think anytime you mention the IRS, people cringe a little bit in general. And then when you talk about withholding funds, and you don't quite understand the purpose behind it, that makes it even more complicated. Mm-hmm. Tell me what, in as brief as possible, what the law requires if you're a foreign seller, and perhaps even what a foreign seller, what it means to be a foreign seller, or what
Sure.
It's not.
So a foreign seller is a foreign person is defined as a non-resident alien individual, a foreign corporation that hasn't asked to be treated as a domestic corporation, It means a foreign partnership, a foreign trust, or a foreign estate. Specifically, when we are talking about individuals, it means non-resident alien. So a non-resident alien is a really weird way of saying that someone is not a citizen and they don't live here. So non-resident means that they don't live in the U.S. and alien means that they're not a citizen. So someone who is not a citizen and doesn't live in the United States would be subject to a 15% holdback on the sale of their property, unless there's some sort of other exception.
Okay. Well, let's talk about what the exceptions are then.
So one exception to FIRPTA is that you're not foreign, is that the seller's not foreign. So not being foreign is an exception to FIRPTA. But once you've determined that the seller is foreign, some of the other exceptions are, the big one has to do with the buyer actually, which is also a really weird concept. But basically the IRS says that if the selling price is $300,000 or less, and the new buyer is an individual, not a company or some other entity, but an actual individual, and they're going to purchase in their own individual name, if they have definite plans to use the property as a residence for at least 50% of the total number of days during year number 1 and then year number 2 after the closing, then they can waive the withholding. There doesn't have to be a withholding. So that's an exception. So we run into that a lot in our neck of the woods. I don't know what it's like in Naples, but we have a lot of properties here that are still being sold for well under $300,000. And so there are a lot of transactions that go through where FIRPTA isn't required because the buyer has made a declaration that he's going to use the property as a residence. That's one of the big exceptions. And there's other exceptions too that we really don't run into. Another one is like a withholding certificate. So a withholding certificate is an application that usually the seller makes before closing, where he can submit proof documents to the IRS and show how much money he's making on the sale. And that way, instead of the withholding being a percentage of the selling price, it can be a percentage of the profit, a percentage of the gain.
That sounds pretty appealing. It seems like most people would want to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a process, and it has to be mailed on or before the date of closing. If it's mailed after the closing, then that's a problem. But as long as the application is mailed on or before the date of closing, then the withholding amount, the 10 or 15%, whatever it ends up being, instead of going to the IRS, it can stay in an escrow account. Usually with whoever's going to be doing the closing, that money can stay in their escrow account. And then we wait for the IRS to respond. Now, the problem with a withholding certificate today on, October 21st, 2020, is that our government is severely behind because of COVID. So the IRS was shut down. Certain departments were shut down for many, many months. And unfortunately, the FIRPTA unit was one of them. And so what used to take 90 days to process is now taking more like 9 months. So a withholding certificate used to sound appealing, but it's not as appealing as it used to be because of the amount of time that it takes to hear back from them. And especially this late in the year, considering that you can file a tax return naturally in February or March even of next year, with a 9-month processing timeline, by the time we hear back from the IRS, you could have already, filed a tax return and possibly even received your refund. So we're kind of in a unique situation right now because of COVID in regards to withholding certificates. But yes, they are usually very appealing.
So tell me, this touching back on something else you said, regardless of whether I make money, there's this fixed percentage that the IRS is requesting to be withheld. Mm-hmm. So if I am underwater, let's say I borrowed money from somebody or some institutional lender, and I don't even have enough to pay them back, that means I could have to bring money to the table just to remit the IRS their percentage unless we got this withholding approved?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're in a situation where by the time you pay off the mortgage and pay off the real estate taxes, and sometimes there's a judgment or a lien that needs to be paid off, and you've got real estate commission and title fees and transfer taxes. Just like you said, sometimes there's just not enough money in the deal to cover everything. And so in that situation, what we have to do is we have to apply for the withholding certificate, and we actually have to push the closing out until the withholding certificate is received, shows a lower amount, and then proceed with the closing, with only having to withhold a lower amount or none at all if they approve
That's
the
interesting.
certificate for zero. Yeah.
Yeah, I fortunately have not had that happen to any of the transactions that I've handled, but we have had a number of other circumstances occur, such as having to withhold money that maybe you don't have a loan that you have to pay off, but you certainly didn't make any money, and we always get the question from the seller why they still have to remit. Now, tell me, speaking of the seller, you must hear the same questions over and over. What are the 3 most common questions that you receive by foreign sellers?
So foreign sellers always ask the same 3 questions. They always want to know, do I really have to do this? How much is it going to cost me? And when do I get my money back? And, what we do when we're talking to a seller for the first time is we kind of run their numbers, very preliminary numbers. We figure out, what did they pay for the property? What are they selling it for? Did they have any capital improvements? Was it a rental? Was it not a rental? Is there depreciation recapture? Do they have any suspended losses? The whole 9 yards. But we run their numbers to see, number one, does the withholding certificate even make sense? And if not, then we go ahead and suggest that the money just gets submitted to the IRS immediately after the closing. And then that gives us an opportunity to help that seller, apply for a tax ID number if they need one. And then we file the tax return and we report the sale. We figure out how much tax they actually owe on the property. And then they're entitled to a refund of, any amount of the withholding that wasn't required to satisfy the tax liability. And so the first question is, do I really have to do this? Usually the answer is yes. Yes, you have to do this. Of course, we look and see if there is an opportunity for an exception. For example, what's the selling price? Who's the buyer? How are they going to use it? Does there have to be a withholding? So we always look and see if there's an exception first. And then, how much is it going to cost? Well, that depends on who they use for their services. We provide different services at our company, and based on how they want to handle it, the fees are associated with that. And then when can I get my money back? Well, again, it depends on how did we handle it. So, under normal circumstances, if a property sells and someone applies for a withholding certificate, if they're not making a ton of money on that deal, when the IRS issues the certificate, it'll say, we reviewed your application. We agree that 15% of the selling price far exceeds your maximum tax liability. Therefore, we have reduced the withholding down to X. So then once that certificate is issued, we can go to the closing agent or who was ever holding escrow, and we can say, hey, with the certificate came in, let's go ahead and disperse this account. And then we only have to send in the reduced amount to the IRS as an advance tax payment, and the balance of the escrow account can be released to the seller. So depending on when that property sells, that seller, if they apply for a withholding certificate, they can get a huge chunk of their money back fairly quickly. So in contrast to that, if we don't do the withholding certificate, then the money goes to the IRS. We have to wait till we can file a tax return. Now, here we are, the end of 2020, right? So someone who sells a property in 2020 gets to file a 2020 tax return. And we know that we can file that in February or March and we can get their refund going. But if someone sells a property in January of 2021, well, we can't file a 2021 tax return until 2022. So that means they're going to go a whole year and a half before they see, a dime, a penny of their money. So it just really depends. So the main question, when can I get my money back, depends on what time of year it is. How are we handling the withholding? How quickly can we file that tax return or that withholding certificate to get their money back?
And now this new variable of how long the IRS takes to respond, since they're currently backlogged, which could continue into next year. At this point, we don't really know, right?
Yeah, and that's the scary thing is you don't know. Things seem to be moving along, and And, they seem to be picking up pace. But then, in the news, it says, if you believe the news, it says that the cases are going up. So, who knows what's going to happen next month or 6 months from now, if there's going to be another shutdown or.
Right. Well, tell me now, it's my understanding of the IRS rule that the buyer is responsible for withholding, but most buyers send their money to an escrow agent. Most real estate is sold where a title company or an escrow agent or a real estate law firm is handling the money. Are there any situations that you've come across where a buyer where there's not an escrow company being used?
Yeah, we handle some FIRPTA transactions for private sales. And it always makes me wonder how they even figured out that FIRPTA was required. When they're not using real estate agents, they're not using title companies or real estate attorneys to do the closing. They just have a private sale, from usually it's one foreign person to another, to be honest with you. But yeah, absolutely. And depending on the situation, FIRPTA still applies there. And so what they do is, or what's been done is when the buyer makes that payment to the seller, they pay all of it except for the 10 or 15% that is required to be sent to the IRS as a withholding tax for that seller.
Interesting. Are there any considerations if I'm buying property, let's say I'm a Canadian resident and I'm buying from another Canadian resident, and that Canadian resident wants to file for an exception, but I, as the buyer, don't have a tax ID number yet. Is there something that's supposed to be done for that seller to withhold?
Okay. So in your example, you're saying you've got a Canadian seller and then you have a Canadian buyer.
Yes.
What's the selling price?
$400,000.
All right. So at $400,000, we know that there is definitely going to be a withholding. And depending on how the Canadian buyer is going to use the property, it's probably going to be, 10%. But let's just say 15%. So in your example, I think if I'm reading you correctly, you've got two Canadian parties. Neither one of them has a tax ID number. And according to FIRPTA law or the tax code, they would be required to apply for one. So there's a Treasury decision that requires all buyers and sellers in a FIRPTA transaction to have a tax ID number and provide it on all their forms. So number one, it's super important for buyers to have tax ID numbers in these FIRPTA transactions when money is being withheld, because when the money goes to the IRS, when it gets submitted to the IRS, it gets stored under that buyer's tax ID number. So it's important for a buyer to have a tax ID number, a social or an ITIN number, because that's how they get credit for doing their job as the withholding agent, right? And then from a seller point of view, it's super important for them to have a tax ID number as well, because number one, they won't get a valid receipt for the withholding until they have a tax ID number. And they need a tax ID number to file the tax return, and they need a valid tax ID number to receive the refund. So there's a lot of foreign people here that have tax ID numbers. Actually, there's a lot of foreigners that have social security numbers, which is great. But the other type of tax ID numbers, a number that individuals have, is called an ITIN number. It stands for Individual Tax Identification Number, ITIN. And the problem with the ITIN numbers is they expire. So back in 2000, I don't know, I think it was like 2016, the IRS decided that ITIN numbers were going to expire after 3 years of non-use. So anyone that had an ITIN number for a number of years, had no idea that their number expired. So when we would go to file their tax return and claim a refund of the FIRPTA withholding, the IRS wouldn't give the money back because their number had expired. So not only do they have to have a number, but it has to be valid and unexpired in order to receive a refund.
That I did not know. And fortunately, I haven't been confronted with that set of circumstances, but I have dealt with the other situation where the buyer did not have a tax ID number. And it comes down to, who's required to pay for it. So I don't know if you see who ends up paying for what, but if the buyer is required to withhold satisfy FIRPTA because the seller is foreign. How does that typically get handled as far as who pays the accountant to deal with the withholdings?
So, I mean, if you would have asked me that question a year ago, I would have said sellers all day long. Traditionally, from an industry point of view, anytime we talked about FIRPTA and accounting fees, if there were any, they were always handled by the seller. But now that it's a little more, now that there's more awareness about FIRPTA and people understand that buyers are ultimately responsible for the withholding, there's been a small shift in the paradigm where the buyers are being asked to, prepare these forms for the closings and then, pay for the cost of them. So it's not super common, but it is becoming more common that the buyers are being asked to foot the bill on getting the tax documents prepared to send this money in. I would love to get to a point where some of these items could be, worked out in a like a FIRPTA addendum, maybe to the contract.
Right. I do believe that there is some language, and I don't want to get too into it today because there's different forms of the contracts used across the state. In Naples and Collier County, we have our own agency contract, and in Lee County, there's the Florida Realtors contract known as FARBAR. And then there's other variations of the form in different parts of the state. But I do believe it's addressed at whose expense the withholding is. But then there's this question of who the withholding agent is. So the rules say that the forms themselves use this terminology, the withholding agent. Tell about like who is the withholding agent, even when there's an escrow agent involved in the withholding itself.
Yeah, so the IRS defines the withholding agent as the buyer or other person who acquires real estate from a foreign owner. And so in a real estate transaction, you have a buyer and a seller. You have a payer of money and you have a receiver of money. And the person that pays the money is the withholding agent. And the IRS clearly defines that in the forms that we use for these types of transactions. It's in black and white, that the buyer is the withholding agent. Does that answer your question?
I'm just making some notes here because one of the things that we come across is, after the fact, the buyers say that they didn't realize that they had to go through all these steps. And I don't know if you get confronted with that. We're at the stage that you get involved, but for anyone that's listening, make sure you know that your seller, whether or not FIRPTA applies and whether there's an exception and whether your seller's foreign and has everything in line, because it could delay your transaction. Like Julie said, in some cases, months, depending on the time of year. And, in other cases, it may even kill the deal. So the contract requires most contracts the form contracts in Florida require the parties to cooperate with one another to comply with FIRPTA requirements. So question is, what exactly does that mean? And not every scenario is spelled out in the contract. So buyers, make sure you read those contracts, and sellers, make sure you properly disclose so you don't have something catch you in the end when you're expecting on using those proceeds to make another purchase.
Yeah. And I know that you don't want to get too much into the contract language, which is fine, but some of the contracts that they do use do mention FIRPTA and some of the options that are available. And I've known of several deals recently, actually, that they just couldn't come to terms on, and nobody talked about FIRPTA in the beginning of the contract, but now here we are days, before closing, and the seller wants to apply for a withholding certificate. They want the money to be held in escrow, and the buyer's not okay with it. They just don't want anything to do with it. And depending on what contract you're using, the buyer is holding all the cards. They get to say if the money can stay in escrow or not. And so there's been several deals recently that fell apart at the last minute because the parties felt bullied into performing in an area that they just weren't comfortable, in a direction they weren't comfortable going. And so regardless of what contract you use, it's so important to talk about FIRPTA, in my opinion, on every transaction. I don't know if I've told you, but we started a movement, an awareness movement. It's a hashtag, and it's hashtag FIRPTA first. And it's this concept that literally every transaction, every real estate transaction is subject to FIRPTA first until we find out that it's not. Every seller is foreign until he declares that he's not. And that's just the safest way to handle it, is we just have to assume that FIRPTA is a part of every transaction until,
like innocent until proven guilty, right?
Exactly. Literally.
Or in this case, guilty until proven innocent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, when
it's
you say
hard to know
FIRPTA
who
first,
yourself.
that hashtag, is it number 1 ST or is it first spelled out?
It's first spelled out. Hashtag FIRPTA first.
All right, so you guys listening can check out hashtag FIRPTA first to see what other types of conversations are coming with that tag in it.
Yep. We just started it. So start the conversation. We had t-shirts made because let me tell you where I'm coming from, Matt, and I'll just share this personal story with you. But a couple years ago, I got a phone call from a buyer. He was a man, an elderly gentleman. They had purchased a property from a foreign seller. There was an accountant that was representing the seller. There were attorneys that were involved, and everyone was thinking that they were doing everything right. And so what happened was the seller's accountant reached out to the buyer and said, hey, we're trying to put this withholding certificate together, but we're just not ready yet. Can we have a few more days to get it together? And it seemed like a reasonable request to the buyer. And so he said, sure. Well, a couple days later meant days after closing. And so, long story short, the withholding certificate didn't get submitted prior to the closing, and then when it was submitted, the IRS rejected it because it was a late filing. And in that situation, it was determined that that because it was a late filing, that by the time the money was remitted, it was 4 or 5, 6 months late, whatever it was, because that's how long it took to process the withholding certificate. So they didn't want to honor the rejection because of the type of rejection that it was. So long story short, there was a penalty that was assessed to the buyer for over $60,000.
Wow.
And from the time he had bought the property to the time that this occurred, he had lost his job. He didn't have the same finances that he did when he bought the property, and he wasn't in a position to pay the $60,000. And now the property, the requests from the IRS were first they just wanted payment, and then they threatened to seize the property. And by the time he called my office, he was crying on the phone. And
I'd be crying too, I think.
Yeah. And, it touched me in such a way that when I hung up the phone, I wasn't the same person I was before I picked it up. And I sat there for a second and I wiped my eyes, and, there wasn't really a lot that I personally could do for him. I referred him to a couple different people, but I was like, man, like, how does this keep happening? Why? It's call after call after call. Why does this keep happening? And it all comes down to awareness. And, there's just not enough of it. And whether it's some silly hashtag like FIRPTA first, or, whether it's something else, I just feel like we have to do a better job of making sure that we are addressing the issue of FIRPTA on every transaction, and giving these buyers and these sellers the information that they need to make educated decisions about what their next move is. And it's really important to me that we can get to a point where we can do that. I was talking to an IRS agent last night. She was actually helping me on a file that is a really rough file, actually. But she was saying, I wish that when FIRPTA was involved, that buyers there was some sort of national disclosure form that every buyer had to sign that told them about FIRPTA, on a transaction. This is an IRS agent. I was like, that's so funny that you feel that way, because I feel the same way. You know,
Right.
if they're getting a mortgage, they remember when they used to have to sign the truth in lending, and they were what was that little flyer that they had for, their rights as a, what am I trying to say?
Well, if I sold real estate, I'd be able to tell you. I know it's fair housing, I think, is the disclosure you're thinking of.
Absolutely. But just
There's
think
a
of,
couple other required.
just think about the impact that would have, that, when someone buys a property, that they have to sign off, on what FIRPTA is and what it means and what their role is as the buyer in that transaction.
Yeah. I
Um,
think the contracts can only do so much. It involves having a proper professional work for you when you are buying and selling real estate, period. And whether it be your real estate attorney, your real estate agent, your real estate broker, or even a trusted advisor, if
Absolutely.
you go at this by yourself, then you're more prone to fall victim to some of these things that, had you known a little bit more, it wouldn't have ended the way it did. Tell me, what I asked you about, what sellers should consider, when you have a buyer come to you, what are the
Hmm.
three most common questions you get from buyers?
Why didn't anybody tell me? What the heck is FIRPTA? And why is it my responsibility?
Okay. And that seems pretty realistic to me because, does it mean that they're not reading the contracts? Does it mean that the listings don't have enough information? Does it mean that their real estate agent isn't diligent in either seeking information or communicating? I don't know. All I know is that those questions are going to continue.
Hmm.
And anybody who's listening today that buys real estate, make sure you know who you're buying it from, especially if you're not using an agent. If you're an agent, make sure you understand what the requirements are for the buyer and the seller so it can be part of the negotiations and you understand realistic timelines.
Yeah.
And that's the best thing that you can do. You'd be doing your client, especially if they're buying from a foreign seller or they are a foreign seller, you'd be doing them a disservice if you don't do that extra work.
Yeah. And
Um,
if you're a listing agent, do your best to find out right away if FIRPTA is going to be, a part of your transaction, a part of the transaction for that seller. Find out if your seller's foreign.
right. Well, I appreciate you giving us all this insight that most people, unless they're involved in a situation, don't get to hear. And some of the takeaways I have from is that so ITINs expire after 3 years of non-use. I think that's a big one.
Hmm.
Buyers responsible will hold the money, and we already know they can be penalized with real money and fines if it's not done properly. So use an
Hmm.
escrow agent,
Yeah.
and one that understands the ramifications of not sending stuff in time as well.
Hmm.
And if you're buying from a foreign seller, make sure that you know at the time you enter the contract whether FIRPTA applies and also whether they're actually foreign, barring there's no exception. And then don't
Right.
forget about the hashtag FIRPTA first movement. Check that out, anyone that's listening. And Julie, why don't you tell us how to reach you or how to learn more about FIRPTA
Sure.
solutions and what parts of the region you all cover?
Yep. So we're nationwide, and we have a website. It's FIRPTAsolutions.com. We are very active on Facebook. We're very active on Instagram. Um, we have a phone number, an email, info@FIRPTAsolutions.com. You can call and email and get right to me. And, we can talk about different deals and different transactions. And, quite
And
honestly, I
where
don't
do
know
you,
all
if
the
someone wanted to
answers,
talk
but
to you in person, where do they find you in Florida?
I'm in Cape Coral. I'm in Cape Coral, Florida. I'm right on Cape Coral Parkway.
Okay. And
And
does FIRPTA Solutions have another office in the state?
no, we just have one office in Cape Coral.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate your time. Just to leave everybody with that, the best phone number to reach you if they don't want to go online, what's that phone number?
239-540-1022. Ask for
All
Julie.
right.
And
Well,
actually,
Julie,
we
I
have,
appreciate.
let me just share one more thing, Matt, if it's okay. We have
Sure.
people here that speak different languages. So we have processors that speak Spanish, French, German, and Portuguese.
Oh, that's really good to know. Thanks for mentioning that. Well, I appreciate your time, and I thank you for being a guest today.
Thanks, Matt. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Goodwin Law Unplugged. To learn more about Goodwin Law and to utilize our services, visit GoodwinEstateLaw.com or call 239-207-3403. Hablamos Espanol. To submit questions or be a guest on a future episode, message us on our website or on social media by searching for Goodwin Law PA in Naples, Florida. This has been Goodwin Law Unplugged. Thanks again for joining us.